Well, thank you for joining me. You honor me with your presence. We're studying Deuteronomy in the New Testament. It's part of our quarter-long study of the present truth in Deuteronomy. And I have to ask you a couple of questions. We studied over the next to last lesson. Do you know what the structure of Deuteronomy is? Do you know what its purpose is or the process through which it was delivered? I'm sad to say the answer to those questions is no, not if you were looking in the lessons. I've touched on it a little bit. If you'll stick with me tonight, we'll answer the questions as to why this happened the way it did, and we'll also rectify that and give you a real sense of the structure and the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy. Meanwhile, we're going to be talking about Deuteronomy in the New Testament. And there you have a very appropriate memory text for this. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. This is from the New King James Version. This is very appropriate because Jesus is in the wilderness here in Matthew 4, and he's quoting Deuteronomy to the devil. In fact, all three of the texts that he quotes are from Deuteronomy, and they describe situations where, for example, Israel failed the test. First of all, Lucifer says, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus remembers that the Israelites were upset because they didn't have any bread. And God gave them manna instead. And so he quotes a text that refers to this failing. And he does this in each case. There's a situation where Israel failed and Jesus succeeds. But these texts are used in all four accounts of the wilderness temptation. But the wilderness temptation is treated very differently in Matthew. And I'm going to show you why. Now, those of you who have been with me for a long time will have seen this before. I hope that this doesn't upset you. I think it's worth repeating because it shows the difference between the topical approach, which is what we've had. Supposedly, we were supposed to have 2 books of the Bible every year and 2 topical studies, but as it has turned out, the present truth in Deuteronomy has turned out to be a topical study, masquerading as a book study. Now, I don't know whose fault this is. I don't know if it was some of the committee changes that were made. All I know is that it ended up not being a study of the book of Deuteronomy per se. And I mention that because we've not talked about the structure of the book and how it's, the purpose and all of that. We've, in fact, in many of the lessons, although this lesson is titled Deuteronomy and New Testament, we spend a lot of time in the New Testament while supposedly studying Deuteronomy over the last number of weeks. Kind of like the Israelites, we've been wandering through the book of Deuteronomy and never quite reaching the promised land. But we hope to remedy that tonight. Stick with me and we'll see. I mentioned that, but what has happened is that the author gave us a very good idea here of the usage of Deuteronomy in these temptations. But here's what he gave us, just this part. And we said Israel was tempted and they failed. Jesus is tempted and he quotes Deuteronomy. Now, as you'll see, there's a lot more parallels here. In fact, I'm going to fill up this table. And I'm going to show you that many of the things that make this table work are, in fact, only in Matthew. And it will also explain some things where we might think Matthew plays fast and loose with the text. We think that Matthew might be topical rather than being exegetical. But when we look at what's happening here from a narrative point of view, it's a very different story. So let's look at this. I'm just going to fill in all this on Israel. Judah, Jacob himself was born in Canaan. His name was Israel, and his children are all born in Canaan. When the famine came, Israel went to Egypt, and they went there to stay and to survive. Before they came out, Pharaoh declared that all the boys under 2 years of age had to be killed. That was the slaughter of the innocents. Then the Exodus came and they left Egypt. And looking back on that in Hosea, the book of Hosea, Hosea says, out of Egypt have I called my son. Now, we're including this because it's going to be included in Matthew, the uses of the Old Testament and the New, not just Deuteronomy here. And the problem is that Hosea 11 is looking backwards. It's not a prophecy about something forward. It is saying, I have brought you back out of Egypt. When they left Egypt, they passed through the waters of the Red Sea. And they went into the wilderness where they stayed for 40 years. They were tempted. They failed. And while they were in the wilderness, they went to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Moses received the law. Now, what's interesting is that Matthew wants to speak to a Jewish audience and convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. And he does it through many means, some of which I'm not even going to touch on here because there's so much more to what Matthew does in the first 5 or 6 chapters of Matthew. But I want to show this because we were shown this little snapshot. Yes, Jesus is tempted and he quotes Deuteronomy. But here's what happens in the book of Matthew. Jesus is born in Judea and he goes to Egypt. It's only in Matthew that it's mentioned that he goes to Egypt. As he departs, or just after he departs, there's the slaughter of the innocents. Herod decrees that every boy under the age of 2 in the general area of Bethlehem is to be slain. And so there's a parallel here between Moses, who was the only one who survived out of his generation, and Jesus, who survived out of his generation. Then came the Exodus. And quoting at this point, this is where Matthew quotes, out of Egypt have I called my son. And the point is, we say, well, that wasn't a prophecy. He wasn't looking forward. But as you look at this chart that I'm showing you, what you see is that Matthew has a bigger purpose in mind. His purpose isn't just about the prophecies that we're specifically looking forward, but his point is that Jesus is everything that God had wanted Israel to become. And so in Matthew, he goes through all of these same experiences, but only in Matthew, so that he is personifying Israel, who was called to keep the covenant. And in this case, Jesus keeps the covenant. As the children of Israel passed through the waters of the Red Sea, Jesus, the next thing in order in the book of Matthew is his baptism. And immediately after the baptism, it says that he was driven by the Spirit into the desert, where he spent 40 days, a day for a year. So the day-year principle, again, shows up in the Bible. It's just the way they thought. It's a common idea that was in the ancient world. And then in Matthew 5, he goes to the mountain. And seeing his disciples, he went to the top of a mountain, and there he gave them the new law. The Sermon on the Mount takes place on that mountain. And if you see all of those entries that have asterisks, goes to Egypt, slaughter of innocents, leaves Egypt. Out of Egypt have I called my son, that quotation. And goes to the mountain for the Sermon on the Mount. Luke reports many of the same things that Jesus said on the mountaintop, but he doesn't have him there. And he declares a new law. Jesus says, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill, but I say to you. And so he is elaborating on the law of Moses. So Matthew is using this and looking at it. We have to look at this whole narrative and see how it mirrors the narrative of the Old Testament to recognize what Matthew is doing. He's not misusing Hosea. He's showing there's more depth to Hosea than we even understood before, that Jesus lives to fulfill everything that God had chosen Israel to be. But where Israel failed, Jesus succeeds. Now, the only thing we've had on the structure before is something I showed, I think, in the 3rd or 4th lesson on this, but there is more to the structure. And here's the basic structure of Deuteronomy, but we haven't been told, at least we have, it hasn't been very obvious. And that is the book of Deuteronomy consists of 3 sermons or speeches where Moses is declaring God's will and his law for the children of Israel as they're about to enter and to occupy the promised land. And so these three sermons take this form. In chapters 1 through 43, we have the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And so he's reminding us that, you spent 40 years, your generation only knows wandering. Now you're going to have to settle down and occupy the land as the people of God. And so you need to understand what that entails. The next step is the chapters 44 through 29:1 is the need to follow Yahweh and his laws on which the possession of the land depends. They aren't going to keep the land if they don't keep God's law. And this isn't an arbitrary thing where God is going to punish them for it. On quite the contrary, this is a situation where they simply won't be able to maintain a society if they treat each other badly. And so these laws are necessary for the cohesiveness of the society and the continued occupation of the land of promise. And of course, we covered this quite a few times in these lessons. It's so important to understand this. The next and the third and final of these sermons or speeches is that he's saying, even if you should prove unfaithful and lose the land, that with repentance, all can be restored. God wants you to have this land, and you need to keep his laws to keep it. But even if you don't, he will not forget you. This is an amazing thing. And so we tend to think of Deuteronomy, second law, as a book about legalism, a book about requirements. But it's a book about promises. It's a book about relationships. Because you love the Lord your God, you want to live this way so you can continue to live in rest with him in the land of rest, the land of promise. And then follows a series of events which we can only call the passing of the baton. Because Moses, remember, they said that when the spies refused to go into the land of Canaan, the 10 unfaithful spies, God said that the entire generation would die off except for Caleb and Joshua. That means that Moses and Aaron and Miriam were not going to make it. So this was no secret. And Moses, of course, had a new understanding of this late in the Exodus journey when he struck the rock and God told him how offensive this had become. So that's what's going to happen. Moses knows he's going to die, and they've depended on his leadership. Now, for 40 years, he got them out of the land of Egypt as far as they're concerned. I mean, God did it, but Moses was the instrument of doing that. And now they're going to have someone else, and it's Joshua who's going to take over. Joshua's succession. Interesting, Joshua is exactly the same name in Hebrew as Jesus. Jesus is a Latinized form, Greek and then Latin, of Joshua. Anyway, Joshua will succeed him, and when we study the book of Joshua, if we do soon, we'll recognize that Joshua was picked as the general to conquer Canaan because he was incomparably good. He was a wonderful general, and he demonstrated this during the Exodus, but he's also going to demonstrate it in the campaign to retake the land of Canaan, to take possession. Really a brilliant military strategist. So that's the first thing. People have to know who's going to take over. Succession is always important. And so when Moses dies, it's clear that Joshua will be the leader of the people after Moses is gone. And Moses has two more things to do then. One is he gives the law to the Levites. So here you have the passing of the civil and the religious leadership. So he gives the mantle of civic leadership to Joshua and the mantle of religious leadership to the Levites. Nothing new about that. God had done that. But that's the way he proceeds in this matter. So The leadership on a day-to-day basis is taken care of. The religious needs of the nation are taken care of by his passing the torch. So really, it's a very orderly process when you think about it. He's setting his affairs in order, as we say. And this is interrupted by the Song of Moses, which goes on for some time, and it's really a very beautiful song. Song of Moses interrupts this process. And then Moses goes up onto Mount Nebo. And he goes up onto Mount Nebo because from Mount Nebo, he can see into the land of promise. You know, from a height, you can see a long, long ways. And that's what he's doing. He's going up there, and God is showing him literally, you know, physically, and also probably in vision. God is showing him what can happen. God is showing him what will happen. And there he is on Mount Nebo. And then this is followed by the blessing of Moses. And Moses he blesses each of the 12 tribes. It's a repetition of how Jacob had blessed his sons. Before his death, he goes through one by one and blesses each of them. And Moses now is taking on that role because he's been the leader of Israel, just as Jacob, was the patriarch of his family. Moses has taken on that role, and he is going to bless each of the tribes. And it's a beautiful thing to see. Here it is. And again, I don't feel particularly morbid right now, but I'm nearing the age where you have to consider your mortality. And here's Moses. He's doing such a masterful job. He's handed over the leadership, both religious and military, and other ways. There's been this great song of his wonderful life that he's lived. He climbs the mountain where he gets a vision of the land of the time after he is gone, of his legacy. And then he blesses each of the tribes. He leaves them with his valedictory. He's giving this blessing so that they can carry into the land of promise a sense of potential and promise themselves. And there on the top of Nebo, or near the summit, he dies. And God buries him. You know, it's said earlier that Moses spoke to God, that God spoke to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. And here God lovingly gives his friend burial. Moses, not perfect. He struck the rock. Moses had murdered an Egyptian. Moses was not perfect in his performance, but he was perfect in his commitment to God. And there on the mountaintop, we think of this as a lonely scene, but there on the mountaintop, in his last moment, Moses is not alone. Moses is in the company of his best friend, and that is the God of all the universe. So Moses dies there with the vision of the legacy he leaves behind fresh, and he's buried lovingly by his best friend, God. Now, this structure should have been brought out, and anyway, we're doing it here. It's important to understand. Here's how the book functions, and you can see he's equipping the people to live in their the land they will newly conquer, and he's also passing on in an orderly fashion so that there need not be any chaos, any concern about who's doing what. Joshua's the leader, the Levites are the religious leaders, and each of the tribes has a blessing that expresses their particular role. And so each of them can move forward with confidence that God, through Moses, has directed them and has given them a plan of action so that they can possess the land and they can live in the land for a very long time together in that wonderful state that the Old Testament calls rest. where we can go about the things that we were created to do. Israel could go about the things they were created to do. That was the plan. As usual, we're all human beings. As usual, human beings messed it up, but, it's only so much can be done about that. So there you have this total structure. And I hope it gives you an understanding then of what all is taking place here. This is what a true book study would, at least one of the first things it should do is give you an overview. Here's how the book is structured. Here's what we're going to see. And then we develop that. Unfortunately, this was, as I say, it was a topical description, and we wandered around. I had high hopes because it was set up very well, but we ended up with that. And here's why. We talked about this earlier. And the topical approach is very much like the proof text approach. Why do I say that? Now, is it possible to have a good topical approach, one that is legitimate and properly is expository of the text? Absolutely, it's possible. But it's so difficult. And here's why it's difficult. If you recognize this is very much like, as I say, the proof text approach. You start out with, okay, here's the topic that I'm going to discuss. And you may see a verse in the book of Deuteronomy, say, well, there's a topic I want to talk about, and I want to do that. So you do a word search. And you assume that every time that word shows up, the text fits your topic. And here's the problem. And it doesn't matter which translation you use. The older translations, and the King James was a great translation when it came out, but the older translations didn't have some of the knowledge of Hebrew or Greek, depending on the book, that we have today. And so they often had to struggle to interpret words, and they used common words, and words sometimes which in the English did not mean then what they mean today. So we have a double barrier there. But it's also possible, as Robert Alter points out, that one of the secrets of translation is that they don't just render the text in a different language, but they try to explain it, and sometimes their explanations are simply wrong. It reflects their culture and not the culture of the people who wrote the book, or it reflects their prejudices. This is because, again, we're human beings, and that's the difficulty situation. And so you may find, and in the effort to be simple for modern readers, sometimes differences in language are just simply glossed over. And sometimes it's simply because it's very difficult to render in a few words from one language to another. One example of this is in the New Testament is the Greek, where all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now that sounds like and fallen short. Those sound like past tense, but in the Greek, there's there's several different kinds of tenses. And the first one is all have sinned. That's a point in the past. This is something that took place, and it doesn't change. But then there's something that takes place, and it continues to go on. It's called the continuing present tense. So when it says in Romans, all have sinned, that's a point in the past. You have sinned. Now, there may be many such points, but the point is, no pun intended, each of those is in the past. But then it says, and the Greek verb for falling short is continuous present tense. All have sinned. We've all made these mistakes in the past, and we continually fall short. It isn't that we have in the past sinned and we have in the past fallen short. It is that in the past we sinned and we continue to fall short of God's glorious plan, one translation says. And so, but it's not very easy to say that in English. It's not obvious in English when we translate. The word for word is all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So again, this is the difficulties we have. So if you're going to assume the topic, you're going to do a keyword search, and we need to do a conceptual search as well. And that's much more difficult because it really requires you to know the whole text. But anyway, so you search for keywords and you assume when you find those words, it just makes sense. They were in Deuteronomy. It's the same word, must be the same thing. And so then we put that into our topical approach. The problem is those words may not be the same. And we may be putting an idea into Deuteronomy, or any book of the Bible, which is not inherently there. We read a word, we think of a topic, we say this is what it's talking about, but it may be talking about something else altogether. And again, Colossians with what was nailed to the cross. There was no law. The word for law does not appear when it says it was nailed to the cross. What's there is a bill of indebtedness. So those are two of the problems with that, and this is a typical proof text approach. Now you can do this if you do the hard work, but you've got to do the hard work. And the hard work, if you remember, we had this model. I've altered it slightly to deal with topics and textual evidence instead of just proof texting. But you notice that there's everything circled in red is left out practically. And that process is really crucial because let's look and see what it is. What words did the author use in the original language? What did he use? And are they defined explicitly or by the context? Did he say this is what it means, as we saw in John 15, where Jesus says, this is my commandment. So what words were used? If they're not defined, then we have to expand our context and look. If they are defined, then we say, does that usage fit the topic? When we see the words used, and maybe we have to change our topic to fit the words, to be honest about it. But what if it doesn't? And we can't, it has nothing to do with what we're thinking about. Then we have to exclude that, not include that in our description. Or at best, we list it and say, here's why it's not part of it. But if it fits the topic, we have to include it. But the problem with this whole thing is why this doesn't happen is really fairly simple. And that is, remember, the process is you start from the bottom up. And that is to say, exegesis is about what did the person say? What were the words used by the prophet, by the author of the scripture? So it's a bottom up process. Okay, what did he say? Then biblical theology, what did he believe? What did he understand that to mean? What did he think it meant? And what did his audience think it meant? And then we can say, well, that tells us what we can do today. And that's what the topical part is. How do we live our lives today is systematic theology. But when you take a topical approach, by definition, you're doing it the other way around. You're starting with an understanding of a topic that matters to us today, and you're kind of bypassing, you're assuming that the theology is the same, and you go looking for the words. The process, when you flip the process upside down, it tends to obscure the meaning, and it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, that means what I think it means, instead of doing that hard work that I just showed you. And so that's the problem with topical studies. Is it possible to have a good topical study? It is absolutely possible. It is, and it's a worthwhile thing to do. But the problem is it is so hard to do it right, both because these inherent, our inherent biases as human beings, but because the process itself tends to obscure from us what we're doing. And that's why topical studies can be, or seem to be certainly, all over the place. And anyway, the Deuteronomy is quoted quite extensively in the New Testament. There are many quotations. Probably the most important ones are the ones that we looked at already, the ones in where Jesus quotes it. But we do that. I say that because of the inherent nature of those texts in the narrative of Matthew. And you will find that in the other Gospels, the topics are different. So if you take the same topical approach, you will find that, or let's say you take the book of Deuteronomy and you look in the New Testament, you may find that it's used quite differently and for different purposes in different places. And again, the topical approach tends to obscure those fine distinctions. Well, I hope this has been useful to you. I'm sorry to have taken a bit of excursus this time running around, but I did not want to end the quarter without you having at least some idea of the structure of Deuteronomy and the purpose of it. Next week, the final lesson in this will be about Moses, the death of Moses and the resurrection of Moses. And we're going to go into a very interesting study there because the source that we have about Moses being raised is a non-canonical source. It isn't in the canon. On the other hand, we think it's legitimate. So how do we make such a determination? And is it safe? Well, I must leave you now. I remind you of these 6 ways that you can support the ministry if you'd like to. Please pray for us. Click on the like button at every time. If you click on the like button, it tells YouTube and it tells other people that this is something worth watching, and more people will get the opportunity. Share it if you find it useful. Subscribe, and you will get these all the time. If you click the bell, you'll get the notifications. Feel free to comment on it and contact me if you need to. You can support us financially at patreon.com Bible Journeys. You see that there. But you can also contact me. I've had one recently, and I'm interacting with those who wrote. They had a question, and I was glad to have the opportunity to help. So at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com, you can get a hold of me. Thank you for joining me. May the Lord bless you, and may we meet again in 6 days, Lord willing, and embark together on another Bible journey. Till then, God bless you and keep you.